option. In other words, they really wanted a lot more of President Obama's nominees to get through, so they changed the rules of the Senate to this lower threshold. And so there are a lot of Democrats in Washington now regretting the decision several years back to change it, because you know what? Republicans are going to use those same rules to try to get Brett Kavanaugh on the court.
Okay, Ron Christie, thank you. Remember, in politics, Christian, you reap what you sow. It could come back.
Not just in politics.
Feeling that this time around.
Yes.
No. Okay, let's move on. 2 journalists from the Reuters news agency have been sentenced to 7 years in jail in Myanmar. Jia So-u and Hua Lun have been charged with illegal possession of stolen documents. But during the trial, a prosecution witness said that police planted those military documents on the reporters in order to frame them.
The 2 men were arrested last December while they were investigating the murder of 10 Rohingya Muslim men. The Reuters journalists uncovered the massacre in the village of Indin, where these men were reportedly killed by the Myanmar army and then buried in a mass grave. The army itself later confirmed that grave's existence.
Okay, joining us now is Ambassador Bill Richardson, who in January this year left an international panel that was set up by the Myanmarese government to advise on the Rohingya crisis. Governor Richardson, thank you very much for joining us. Your thoughts on the sentencing of these 2 men to 7 years in prison on this case that you've worked closely with?
Well, I believe the trial of the 2 Reuters journalists was a farce. The sentencing is a mockery of justice. I'm not surprised by the verdict and sentence, because when I was on the advisory board by Aung San Suu Kyi, I raised the journalist issue and I said, you need to release them. This is a case of freedom of the press. And she got angry and said, this is not in your charter, outside of your mandate. And since then, I think the Myanmar government has only offered hollow assurances that rule of law and due process would be respected. Now, these journalists found out about the mass atrocities, and they found out about the mass graves in Myanmar. So I'm personally very depressed. I think freedom of the press is the bedrock of democracy, a view I once thought Aung San Suu Kyi shared. She was a Nobel Prize winner, but she's abandoned this, and it's a sad day for democracy and for freedom of the press and for simple justice.
And Governor Richardson, given that there is such compelling evidence here of a setup from some of the things that we just told our viewers, what can the international community do? How do they apply the pressure to get these 2 men freed?
Well, I think there has to be a concerted international effort of pressure, not just from human rights groups, from the press, from governments, from the United Nations. Possibly that might dissuade the civilian government of Myanmar, but to still pardon these journalists. Aung San Suu Kyi could say to the president of Myanmar, get them pardoned. I think that is simple justice. I doubt that she will do this because of her retreat from democracy, and also because she'll say, well, I'm not going to do it because of international pressure. Other than that, I think sanctions, more focus on the lack of democracy, more focus on the plight of the Rohingyas would help.
It's so ironic, Governor, that of course the Myanmarese government resisted international pressure for so many years and refused to release Aung San Suu Kyi from under house arrest. Do you think